Well, I'm excited to share a two-part follow-up to last week's Frontline Assembly mix, where I was essentially restoring one of my own mixes from the archives. What was that, 58 minutes, that session? Well, the elapsed time of last week's mix was much closer to 4 hours if you factor in all my ear breaks and boring bits that I didn't include in last week's session. Well, it's fun and games to sit around talking about doing a killer mix in 4 hours, but it's confession time, okay? Yeah, last week's mix, the final result, that wasn't a 4-hour mix. That was a 4-day mix. I went back and checked the original timestamps. If I don't share the entire process of what goes into one of my mixes, yeah, I'm doing a total injustice. This whole idea of sharing these long-form mixes, all I'm doing in these long-form mixes is the very last stage. I'm just sitting down and doing a final balance and mix of all the parts making up that track. The real effort is the days leading up to that mix, right? The pre-production that myself and so many other producers put into mixes before they actually sit down and get to that mix. If I was trying to make it look like I could pull off a mix like I did last week in 4 hours, that would be so far from the truth, because the reality is it takes days. Well, I've already thoroughly covered the vocal production that I got up to in this track in a session I posted almost a couple of years ago. So I'll include the link at the end of this one. But for today's session in part 1, I want to focus on the drums and bass, exactly what I did to the rhythm section to prepare it for this mix. For next week's session in part 2, I'm going to dedicate it entirely to the guitar sound because, man, I transformed that guitar sound from the original tracks I received into the end result. And I want to share a step-by-step process of how I pulled that off. Well, just for our own reference and a good starting point, let's take a minute and listen to the A-B comparison of the original reference mix that the band sent me with the tracks and last week's mix. Just pick a couple of random sections in the song. Check it. Yeah, in my own experience, a transformation like the one we just heard takes a whole lot of pre-production. This is not something that I can sit down and just whip together in like a day or something like that. So how do I pull this off? Well, probably like a lot of you, I literally deconstruct the song and I put it back together in a way that's going to work for me when I sit down and do that final mix. Let's have a listen to what I'm talking about. Okay, I've got all the drums soloed and in place as they were in my final mix. Check it. So I'll go ahead and play this solo drum part with all of the tracks that were supplied to me, and then I'll just toggle on and off the samples that I introduced. Check it. Yeah, I love the drum sound that the guys supplied me for this mix, but yeah, it didn't take but a second to realize I'm gonna need to reinforce that kick and snare. There's no way that those original sounds are gonna hold the weight and carry it through my mix. So how do I get that done? Well, in a session like this, and probably like most mixers, I'm working with audio tracks. I don't have all the original MIDI parts that they use to create and program this song. So when I'm working in audio like I am in this track, just simply use Melodyne to convert the audio track to a MIDI track. In this case, a kick and snare, something like that, very simple for something like Melodyne to convert that into MIDI. Yeah, this is a procedure I've used in just about every mix I get up to, and it's absolutely killer. When you start to, have a MIDI track that's following that original kick drum exactly, even with the velocities, you can go in there and start, looking into your own proprietary sample library and trying to find the right sound. This is exactly what I get up to all the time. So you can see the simple result from using Melodyne. I end up with a MIDI track that is playing exactly what the kick drum's playing. Yeah, I recognize that kick sample from my own proprietary library, and I can tell that it's been tuned down to match the tuning of the bass. And this is absolutely critical. If you're gonna go into an artist's track and start reinforcing things, oh man, you gotta pay attention to tuning. Even with the drums, and especially with the drums. Let's have a listen to this kick sample with the bass part playing together. Well, if I take that kick drum and I pitch it up 2 semitones and process it, yeah, we just lost something there. Notice now that that kick drum is not harmonizing with the bass like it was a second ago. If I undo that little change, yeah, now that kick is harmonizing with the bass in a way that translates in my room all the way down to the floor. When you take the time to properly tune everything, your mix comes together in a really good way. And the same thing goes with the snare drum. I just used Melodyne to convert the original snare drum audio track to a MIDI track. Now I can start introducing addictive drums, all kinds of different samples. Check it. That's a drum sound that I know is going to carry me through my mix. There's no question that the addition of a couple of simple kicks and snares can make all the difference to the final result. Well, let's quickly jump back to the original reference mix and listen to a little bit of the chorus. And last week's mix. You can clearly hear that there are substantially more cymbals in last week's mix over that original reference, right? And this is a situation where I actually added those cymbals with addictive drums once again, where I went back to look at the original session and the cymbal tracks that were provided were just not going to be exciting enough. And I could tell that sort of early on in the program. So, these things take time for me as a non-drummer to be able to go back in and basically reprogram the cymbals on addictive. That takes time. Now those cymbals sound like they're actually being played, right? With excitement, and they're carrying the chorus in a really good way. Well, obviously not every engineer is prepared to go to this much effort, but this is Frontline Assembly. This is one of my favorite bands for years, decades. When they approached me about mixing the title track on their new album, oh yeah, you can bet that I'm gonna step up. There's gonna be no hesitation for me. I'm gonna dive into that track. I don't care if I have to replace every single kick drum by hand. I'm gonna get that job done, and I'm gonna get that mix done in a way that makes me excited. You know what I mean? Yeah, there's no question that when someone hands me a track to mix, I don't hesitate to dive right into that track, to tear it right apart and put it back together in a way that is gonna relate in a really good way in the mix. The bass is another great example where the guys designed a killer bass sound. I love this kind of wobble bass. But for me, right out of the gate, it was sort of lacking real substantial bottom. I was sort of missing the entire lower octave below this original bass line. Let's have a listen to it. Well, for many of you that have used Melodyne, you know from experience that that kind of wobbly bass sound is not going to produce a usable result in Melodyne by converting it to MIDI. So when I need a bass part like this wobbly bass to extend another octave down, I pick up the phone and I reach out to my network. In this particular case, I called my humble brother up, Traz. I sent him a reference mix and this wobble track, and a few hours later, he sends me back this awesome sub bass track. Check this out. And the two of them together, it makes such a big difference, this sub track. Let's listen to everything unsoloed. Take it out. Yeah, extending that bass part a whole octave lower, it doesn't just extend the bottom end, it absolutely puts more attitude in the bass part. I swear that when you sometimes introduce another octave below a regular bass part, it can just get so mean sounding. That's exactly what happens here. The addition of this sub bass part, to my ear, doesn't just extend the bottom of the bass part, it actually changes the bass part, makes it way more cool sounding and just kind of evil, just sitting down there holding its own while this absolutely killer guitar riff is just crushing along on the outsides. I love it. Yeah, huge shout out to my humble brother Traz for contributing such an integral part of this mix. When I mute that sub bass part in any stage of this track, it just seems to fall down a bit. And it's sort of inspiring to know that something so simple can make such a big difference. And I've talked about it in the past, but if you've got a network of collaborators and people that you work with, I hope you're reaching out to them. As a mixer and as a producer, don't just sit in your little bubble trying to do it all by yourself. Reach out and ask for help. It probably only took Traz a couple of hours to do that bass part for me, but what a difference it makes to the mix. And you see, I'm really, really happy that I reached out to Traz and asked him for his help. And I hope that all of you are doing the same thing. Well, thank you very much for sitting in on today's session. And for next week, I want to share exactly how I transformed the original guitar sound into this.